Good morning, everyone. We'll just give people a few more seconds to roll in and then we'll start the webinar. Thank you for joining us. Okay, everyone, let's get started. Good morning. My name is Dr. Pamela Robinson, and I'm the Interim Director Academic of City Building Ryerson. It's a university-wide initiative to mobilize and showcase city building and urban innovation from across the institution and beyond. Thank you for joining us today for our Fresh Voices series. This is the second in a series of webinars in which we're welcoming new faculty members whose research focuses on a wide range of urban issues with various frameworks. We created this series to shine a light on their ideas and their perspectives and research priorities. And we're excited to introduce our new faces and our new brains to a platform of people who want to engage with Ryerson and our community with city builders across the GTA. We hope you'll join us for the rest of the series. It should be fascinating, and we're making sure to record these so that people can participate along the way. Before we begin, I'd like to first confirm our recognition that Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. You may have heard recently that our university is beginning a process of renaming ourselves in an effort to reconcile the legacy of Egerton Ryerson towards a more inclusive future. If you're interested in this process of renaming, you can learn more about it from the Ryerson's Next Chapter page, and we'll share the link in the chat in just a moment. Before we start the presentation, I have a few housekeeping matters. We're going to start today with a quick presentation from Dr. Galloway, followed with a question and answer part in which we'll be able to share your questions with him. The whole session will last about 45 minutes in total. Your microphones and cameras are off, and you're welcome to use the Q&A window at any time and upvote any questions that you think are interesting or particularly relevant. This session, along with the others in the series, is going to be recorded and posted on the City Building Ryerson website in the days to come. And if you're on Twitter, you can tag us at @CityBuildingRU and contribute using the Fresh Voices hashtag. Okay, now for the main event. Dr. Will Galloway, our speaker today, is an assistant professor in the Department of Architectural Science. He's recently come to Toronto, just before the pandemic started, in fact, from Tokyo, Japan, where he was living and teaching and acting as the founder and the design director at Front Office Tokyo, which is his professional design practice. Will's interests include architecture and urban planning, resiliency planning, and sustainable design. Will joins us today sharing his belief that we need to do more than just adapt to climate change. And his research is aimed at developing a better understanding of how we can build more resilient structures in cities from the beginning. He's recently co-edited a book that starts to look at the 2011 tsunami disaster in Japan. And the book is called Rethinking Resilience, Adaptation, and Transformation at a Time of Change. And today what Will is going to do is he's going to share with us some of his most recent work based in Japan and talk about how architects and planners are coping with urban change at a massive scale. So as you'll soon see, there's a lot that we can learn from this approach. It's also potent, I think, when we start to gather all of the people who we would normally have as part of our city building tent. So Will, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks very much for inviting me, actually. So let's see if I can share my screen. Hopefully you're seeing a picture from the rooftop of a building in Shibuya.
Yes.
Okay, great. So this is I actually live really close to here. I love Shibuya. So I guess what I'll try to do, and I'll keep this brief, is I'll just give a glimpse of some projects. I won't get into any of the design really, but just highlight some of the thinking behind them and some of the things that prompted me to, I guess, think about what I was looking at and what I was experiencing. So Tokyo is this place, it changes all the time. It's just constant change. And I think that's kind of well known by now because of all the popular mythology that's grown up around that. But the thing that I wanted to talk about actually was, um, well, it's not Godzilla specifically, but it's kind of this issue about what a disaster means and what it means when change happens when you're not expecting it. And the thing that really shook me, I suppose, is the fact that, of course, everyone saw, or if you're old enough, you probably saw some footage of this massive tsunami that waved over, sort of rolled over the whole coast of northern Japan in the area called Tohoku. It was absolutely astonishingly in its scale. Something like 120,000 houses were destroyed. I think it was almost 2,000 people. No, that can't be right. It might be 20,000 people died. But in any case, it was really, really big. The houses all survived the earthquake, and then they were destroyed by the tsunami. So there's this kind of gap between what people expected to happen and what actually happened. And I kind of, right after that, our whole school mobilized, and we went up north because I was working in this practice-based education campus where students get involved. And so we went up within 2 weeks after the disaster, and we saw what was going on. And then it became immediately clear that the disaster that we saw in front of us, which was powerful and potent, what was not the whole story. And so it's not just this really big, the Godzilla type stuff that's happening. It's also these small things. And so in this case, it's the problem of the aging population in Japan, which is, it's not bigger in the sense of the really quick impact of the disaster that we saw in Tohoku, but it's actually this long-term huge problem that will add up to something much bigger than that big disaster. So within about 2 weeks, I guess this is a photo taken, I think is probably within the first 2 weeks, right after that disaster. And this is the city of, our city in Tohoku, in quite up north in a city called Kesunuma. And the city was completely wiped out. It was the tidal wave that ran through the city, it just overwhelmed everybody. And you can see YouTube videos and things of this. And the problem wasn't so much that the earthquake and so on was damaging the buildings, but that they didn't quite plan for this huge wave to come through. And because they had thought that they had planned enough for it by putting up walls and barriers, not everyone was expecting it to be as bad as it was. So they kind of had built up a feeling of security that wasn't really real. And then after that, because of the tsunami and the earthquake, the land actually subsided. And so, after that, within probably 6 months or a year after this photo was taken, most of it was cleaned up, but the ground had actually subsided. So it was filled with seawater and so on. So when we were there, this is probably the worst because it was just, it was sort of this visceral smell because the water had nowhere to go. It was all the rotting, organic matter and so on lying around. So that was like a huge shock. And then we were working as architects and urban planners and ecologists as this big group, trying to figure out what to do next. How do we react to this in a good way? And we then started to look into the demographics in the area, and we realized that our problem wasn't just about solving this housing crisis, when hundreds of thousands of people lose their home, but also that there is an ongoing long-term problem with the shrinking population. And so, even if we put back everything exactly as it was before the disaster, about 2/3 of the population of the city they would basically die because the population would just age out. And so that's a huge problem. And as a result, we recognized immediately that the traditional, calling it traditional planning, it just wouldn't work. You couldn't, just say, well, let's have a compact city here or something like that, which was a problem because, in fact, that's what the government wanted to do. And so we had a really difficult time um, convincing them that they needed to think a little bit more deeper. And I'll show you what we presented, and this was pretty soundly rejected because they really did want to do the compact city, and I hope that they have it right and that it works. But based on what we saw, so this is a sort of a map of the city. What's going to happen is that the city that was wiped out by the tsunami it almost maps exactly what's supposed to be left over if population decline were the only thing that was going on. And so the places where buildings still remained after the tsunami are the bits that they expected to actually be empty because of the population decline. And so you kind of end up with this like two-sided problem where you'd almost have no city left by 2050. And so rather than making a compact city, we proposed actually that they should just make a linear city. Since everybody was already using cars, we would make a city where the houses could be removed as population decreased. And then we developed some architectural proposals for this, which I won't share with you, but I think it makes sense. And I also think that I suppose not so much that they rejected it so much as their skepticism that a linear city was a good way to go forward, or something based on cars was a good way to go forward. That also made sense. But the lesson we took from it is that if we're going to be dealing with these really big problems, we kind of have to start with what's on the ground, and we have to start dealing with the processes that are already on the ground, and not so much from ideal ideas that we come in, with in our hands and just say, why don't we do this? And that was a really good lesson, I thought. And I'll leave that project there and just sort of move on, because that was already literally 10 years ago now. We just celebrated the memorial of it this year. I wanted to show a few things. So this is where I first lived in Tokyo. It's this kind of Corbusian modernist planning, which everyone taught me in university was horrible and therefore to be avoided as architecture. But it was one of the most wonderful places I've lived in my life. And mostly because Japanese people have learned to live in this kind of place in a very integrated way. So the buildings were actually not set apart from the city, but completely integrated. And so when I first moved to Tokyo, I recognized that what I thought I knew was probably not correct, and therefore I needed to reset all of my assumptions. And so I wanted to explain a little bit about that. So after this, after I finished my PhD, I moved towards a city center to this area, and this was the view from my apartment, which is a completely different typology. But this is actually like 15 minutes from Shibuya, and I was really surprised because I didn't realize it at the time, but it became clear after that it's actually quite normal, that urban farming is all over Tokyo. And this was actually an amazing place to live because it meant that it wasn't going to be replaced with a building, and I wasn't going to lose my view or my access to sunshine. So this, the first picture was like the first 10 years in Tokyo, and this is my view for the second 10 years. And what that meant, and I'm just going to skip over this really quickly, this is actually that area where I was living. I did this kind of just as a very simple study. That whole area is filled with intense mixed use, which is kind of what you would expect. And I think the most important thing about Tokyo is that it's extremely comfortable. It's also really quite ugly. Like it does not look anything like Paris. And perhaps that's a side effect of this sort of outcome. And so I wanted to share with you why it's so easy to live in. Hopefully this will work. So this is just a very simple study showing the demolition and reconstruction of new buildings, just looking through the the land use maps that are published every year in Japan. And so over a period of 30 years, hopefully this will show. Yeah, well, over a period of 30 years, about 30% of the buildings were replaced, which is quite a lot. It's enough to actually change entirely the entire neighborhood. And so once I recognized that that was a very real thing, so I'm just going to move on, if I can get this to work. Then, it starts to mean that how we plan for massive change probably requires that we take advantage of that kind of process of constant, it's almost like, your skin, the cells on your skin are being replaced all of the time. And if we're doing that, then as urban planners coming with only top-down ideas, it's probably not going to be enough. And so this is a recent project, and I thought I would just share it very quickly. Some of the sort of basic assumptions that we're starting with. This is just kind of a cute diagram that one of my students made. If you kind of follow that process and you understand that everything is changing really, really rapidly, if you don't mind that it takes 30 years, which doesn't seem that long in terms of urban planning, then you can actually transform entire neighborhoods simply by changing some of the nudges, the kind of the incentives to build particular kinds of projects. So this is a project for a food, energy, water nexus project that I'm doing with a global group of urban planners in Europe, Australia, North America, and in Japan, and also in Qatar. And so we were each trying to figure out how we could have projects or how we could actually bring together food, energy, and water into our various cities and then compare them. And the starting point for my group ended up being that we would try to do it by taking advantage of this process of change, rather than trying to make an ideal plan. So I can get this to go to the next. And so what that actually means is that, and this is also very high level, sort of abstract sort of view, if we just follow what the building code allows in Tokyo, because it's all parametric and performance-based, it means that there's kind of a definite shape of what buildings might be. But beyond that, there is no sort of this very prescriptive kind of way of working. And so this is also just a very high level sort of sketch showing that different zones will be changing faster and some zones will be changing slower. And so we just recognize that because there's different paces of change in this area, which is going to be redeveloped in any case, that we could perhaps try to approach it not by saying, well, let's have an ideal plan, but rather let's have like 3 separate kinds of ideas that would each respond to the pace of change in these areas. And so it'd be like the commercial zone changes a bit slower because of the costs of doing it. Housing changes really, really fast. And this is all mixed use. And then the thing that changes most slowly is this kind of, it's actually the train station and this semi governmental kind of zone. And so based on that, then we would come up with a bunch of typologies that would be, they were based really on the idea about how we could bring together these ideas in the food production and so on into the center of the city. And so these are actually just real sketches and they're works in progress, but they're based on the idea that instead of making a master plan where we say, try to discern, every little piece of the big picture, we would try to end up in 30 years somewhere closer to something where we would have more food production, more energy production, and water conservation inside the city itself. And these are all just based on taking advantage of that process and using the existing building code. So it doesn't require any negotiation, it doesn't require any big ideas. We can kind of get there simply by taking advantage of what's already there. And that seemed to be the easiest way for us to then scale some ideas. So this again is also just a very simple sketch, but that means that we end up not knowing what the city will look like specifically, but we can propose a direction for different kind of buildings. And then we would also propose a larger scale idea that would allow all of these small projects to plug into a bigger infrastructural change that might take a lot longer. So that was kind of how we approached it. And I know that we're coming up on the end of time. So I'll just finish up with one just last point, because then we're trying to figure out how to move these ideas into other countries. I'm not sure how to do it in Canada yet, but I'm hoping some of these ideas will make sense. But we are doing a project in Belgium, and our first idea was that we would try to make something that could change over time, but that actually became really difficult because of the discussion with the commune and developers. And in the end, what we did though is we tried to respond a little bit to what's going on with COVID, and also to look at how to make density in the city, basically by opening the city up more and creating more green space instead of these sort of city walls that are much more common in Europe. And so this is also a project that's just ongoing, and we'll see if we get planning permission in the next few months. Okay, so I'll just stop it there and maybe we can discuss.
Thanks, Will. So before, I have a couple of questions that I'll start with, but we've got a number of participants who came to hear about your work. And so I'm going to really encourage the participants to put their questions in the Q&A, and I'll go over there after I ask you one or two questions. Will, I want to start with this notion about how being part of being a community member and a city dweller is embracing change and having a growth mindset. You didn't say it using those words, but that's the message that I got from you. And in Toronto, we have a long-range city plan that designates particular neighborhoods as stable neighborhoods, which aren't going to bear the brunt of change. And so what's your thought on how to convince people that being change focused is a good idea? I mean, I've always said that if you don't like change, you shouldn't live in Toronto, because we're a city with a narrative of change. But how do we get people to be more embracing of change?
Yeah, I mean, if I could answer that, then I would probably be the mayor of a city somewhere. Yeah, it's very challenging. I think part of it is cultural, but I suppose it's also about finding how you benefit from what that change means. And I think everyone has to benefit. It can't just be an imposition. It's probably as simple as that in political world.
It's interesting. There are interesting tensions. Like we talk about density so much in Toronto, and density is a number, and people associate density with concrete, but density means new neighbors, and new neighbors mean that local businesses can thrive, right? Or that you may have new opportunities to have new social infrastructure. And so I think we haven't quite got our heads around how to get people to embrace change as being a good thing and not as a threat. Okay, next question for you. I was really intrigued at the beginning when you told the story of how when you went to go and start doing post-tsunami recovery, you went with one set of goals. And once you and your students arrived on the ground, your feet on the ground experience showed you there were other planning challenges that needed to be tackled at the same time. As you know, at Ryerson, we're really trying hard to be a university engaged in practice. How do we get better at creating learning and practice opportunities that are informed by lived experience, and not just what we think should happen and ideas from elsewhere brought forward, or dealing with the obvious, which could also be embraced to include other things that need to happen at the same time?
Yeah. You mean like how our students could have that?
So what can we do? What can you do as an architect in your practice? How do we get better at actually engaging in the complexities of places rather than just going with a single dogged focused minded idea about what should happen?
Yeah, it's something I'm always asking myself too. I think honestly, you have to be curious, which sounds really trite, but I definitely believe that as every kind of situation that you go into, you have to set a lot of your preconceptions aside and start looking at what's there. And you can, there are some tools that you can use. Like you just have to say, I'm going to sit and I'm going to measure and see what goes on, over one day, over 1 month, and start collecting data. And then that's probably the easiest way to do that, especially I find my students are like that. But the challenge that I find in my office also, as well as with the students, is that it's really hard to set what we think we know aside. And so what I'm trying to teach, at least with the students, is a kind of a skepticism about your own awareness of how things work, and trying to always look for what's behind the stuff that you see on the surface. And finding that is a lot harder, but I think it starts with a mindset before any tools are in hand.
One of our great assets, I think, at Ryerson is our student body. We've got students coming from a 2-hour radius, right, in our region and around the world too, but a lot of our students are local and commute to campus. And so with those students comes tremendous lived experience and also plurality of perspective about what livable, inclusive, and sustainable communities can really look like. I also think we really need to work with our students and ourselves to bring a really strong, vital ethic of civic engagement, right? We can check our own biases, which is important, but the more people in the room who have power and opportunity to actually influence and shape the design of their community, the more our own biases are going to be kept in check. Okay, I'm going to nudge our attendees to put questions in the box. There's one simple one, which I'll get to in a minute, but we've got a few more minutes that people can ask questions. I want to talk a little bit about your climate change research. In the bio, I read the discussion piece that talks about how we need to do more than adapt. We know that there are, efforts to reduce climate change emissions through greenhouse gas mitigation, and then our efforts to mitigate the impacts of climate change. They're a little bit like left brain, right brain thinking. Mitigation is a highly technical activity. Adaptation involves more than just technology tools and numbers and data. Thoughts about how to bridge that full arc of action from mitigation to adaptation to resilience?
Yeah. Yeah. These are really easy questions. Mitigation, like trying to fix or trying to bridge mitigation to adaptation is very hard. When I was working in Japan, I was working with a group that was trying to figure out what to do because mitigation was failing. I mean, it just was flat out not working. I mean, we're way too slow. And I think the last report from the IPCC is really confirming that.
Right.
And so we must adapt. We're just going to have to adapt because stuff is coming. And because we were in Asia and we were working in Southeast Asia, where there's lots of sea level rise issue problems and so on, we were always talking to practitioners. And I think many of them had kind of given up on mitigation. It's too late. But then how to adapt is a completely different question. And the thing that I found maybe most provoking was the fact that people are absolutely adapting already, but how you adapt depends on how much access to resources you have. And so, one person, in an area would put their TV or their fridge on top of a box. So when the flood rises, their TV doesn't short or their fridge doesn't short. The people with money would build a new house lifted, a meter off the ground. So we started to see that happening all the time. And I kind of think that that's what's going to be going on from now on. And the only thing that I, in terms of bridging it, I think we're going to have to do both at the same time because our conditions are changing. And so we probably need to come up with plans that recognize that not everybody's going to be able to change at the same pace, recognize that not everyone's going to be able to do as much. And then at the same time, try to reduce, the causes of all this through mitigation. And hopefully it starts to slow down a little bit. I don't know if that bridges it, but at least we're dealing with both at the same time.
And, I think part of the adaptation piece too is that we need to adapt the way that we design, right? And the way in which we plan. Okay, there's
Yeah,
two questions from the Q&A that I'm going to go to. I'm going to combine Catherine Beauchemin, our colleagues' questions. First, Catherine would like to know which part of Tokyo was the Living in Tokyo photo taken in. But more substantively, this is what she says. You speak of ripping out and replacing or renewal and change, but her understanding is that Japan wants to move away from the rip and replace approach. What are your thoughts about that?
I'll tell you where I was living. I was living in a place called Takashima Daira, which is Kita Ward, North Ward in Tokyo. The first one, the one with this housing, which was just so good. One wonderful place to be. The second was in Setagaya Ward, which is closer, right next to Shibuya, which was also amazingly great for completely different reasons. And it was, this idea of rip and replace and sort of tearing down. I think there is a certain group of people who would like to slow that down or change it, but the reason it's like that is because houses depreciate the same way cars do here. So there is this 30-year economic cycle that, your home value, if we're talking just about housing, it goes to zero as soon as your loan is done. So there is no incentive to design for the next person. There are environmental costs to that, but Japan is definitely recycling a lot more than Canada is, for example. A lot of homes are completely taken apart and reused in different ways. So I think it may be more correct to imagine a more environmentally appropriate way of continuing that process, because I don't think we're going to change the banks, and that's going to take some serious investment, and it's also cultural, and I think we might be better off by taking advantage of it rather than trying to suppress it.
Okay, we've got two more questions from the Q&A, and then we'll probably formally wrap up and leave you on for a few minutes in case people want to ask more questions. Cynthia Hua asks, I know that you've mentioned before that Toronto has a long way to go in terms of planning or creating a more interactive city. Are there any lessons or strategies from Japan that we could bring here?
I've been thinking about this, and I don't know if I have an answer yet. I'll answer you with an observation that I think is maybe interesting, and you can tell me if it's off or not. Because I'm really interested in this idea recently of latency, like what is possible with what's already here.
Right.
And one of the things that I noted, and this is just because of COVID, is that going around Toronto, all of the streets, at least where I am in sort of central Toronto, they really changed. The parking turned into restaurants. I mean, when I walk at night at 6 or 7 o'clock, I have to walk through a restaurant because it's the sidewalk, which I think is amazing. It's like, what an amazing experience. It's also annoying as heck, but it's amazing the city had that capacity to do that. And they did it so fast, and the capacity was already here. And, we have a lot of ability to absorb this stuff. In Tokyo, that it's not going to happen. The roads cannot change. They are like, it's like wall to wall. There's no parking on the streets. They're very, very narrow. They're kind of like much more rigid. But the buildings can change like nothing. Like nobody cares. So there's like where the capacity is maybe the thing to search for. So in Japan, if you want to build a new future, you change the buildings, which sounds kind of crazy. But in Toronto, maybe it's about taking advantage of all this amazing capacity to change the streets.
There's been some really interesting work done if you look ahead to whether or not autonomous connected vehicles that are just kind of fleets moving around, what to do with the excess space between parking and roads. It's funny, we did a parking day intervention, which is in the beginning of September, where you take over a parking spot and install an urban street installation. And in the past, by law, people would be very fussed and people would complain. We did one just in front of the planning school a few weeks ago. Nobody cared in a good way. And I think part of it was that the Cafe Toronto process socialized people to the idea that parking can be converted into temporary urban space. Okay, two more quick questions, then we're really going to wrap up. Adam Hollings, how does the free market and conservative-based planning that we see in North America compare to planning in Europe and Tokyo? Do they have a similar developer-based planning in Japan since they have a neoliberal mindset, says Adam?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to, it's Japan is like a Republican dream. It's super. It's all oriented towards profit and capitalism. Um, the, the weird thing is though, like Japan is extremely strict with life safety and things that really, really matter. That stuff you can't mess around with. I mean, there was a period when you could, but that went, I think, up to the 80s or 90s, and then it got really shut down. And so everybody has access to sunshine. That's mandated by law. You cannot cast a shadow on your neighbor, in depending on the zoning, of course, but that's kind of fixed. And so, what buildings look like and how horribly they're built and stuff, that is a complete discussion that we could have, because it is quite horrible. But because everything else is sort of taken care of, accumulatively, it's not so bad. But yeah, it's definitely capitalists first. Yeah.
Okay, very last question from Nicole Gabriel. How can we approach resilience design when the future can be so unpredictable? That's an excellent question.
Yeah. So there's a couple ways. I mean, you can just build in like lots of capacity so that you can just, anything is possible, kind of like a warehouse where, you can put a tiny little, bed or a big house inside a warehouse, and you design for this massive, overscale of, just to capture all the futures. I think more realistically, and this is just my opinion, is that we need to have somehow, within our view about what planning is, an ability to pivot, and we have to be able to change. And the problem is people don't always want to recognize when that's required. But I think that's what it is. If we just talk about Japan, because it's kind of this neoliberal dreamland, they don't have that much regulations, which means that if the population ages, you just build a clinic. As long as it looks like a house, it's about the same size, and it's fine. So there is a way to just build in that capacity without sort of defining in advance all of the problems. And I think we just have to find that mix.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
So I'm going to formally wrap this up now, but we're going to stay live till about 11:45. Just a few parting administrative matters. So first, thanks, Will, for sharing your research with us. This is obviously just the beginning. We probably could have filled about 3 weeks worth of things to talk about, but the good news is that people are welcome to get in touch with you after this session is over. I hope our attendees will think about coming back and joining us on November the 3rd, when my colleague Victor Perez Amato from the School of Urban and Regional Planning is sharing his research on the animation of streets and other public spaces and public realms as part of his research. Victor is a very dynamic designer whose work includes an installation at the bottom of the CN Tower and work on the King Street pilot project. So we look forward to hearing from Victor. We also hope you'll join us for future Fresh Voices sessions. We've been lucky at Ryerson to welcome some amazing new city building colleagues. And all of these sessions are recorded and available on our website. So if you found it interesting and want to share it via Twitter or other social media channels, we'd be most grateful. So we'll formally stop the recording now. Will's going to stick around. So if you want to stay and ask any more questions, you're welcome to. Thanks to the City Building Ryerson team, as always, for making this possible. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. Great.
Thanks.
All right. So Will, one more question popped up in the question. It's from Catherine Bushman. I feel that one of the biggest differences between Tokyo and Toronto is the street structure. Tokyo has large roads that encircle neighborhoods where all the streets are tiny and alley-like. It creates a rural oasis in a quiet residential life within a busy network city. I'm not sure if Catherine's still here. Catherine, you're still here. You can turn on your mic if you want, but it's interesting, how, the ring road structure creates inside and outside spaces.
Yeah,
Can't really impose that in a new city, but are there lessons we can learn, do you think? I mean, we have a hierarchy of roads here, but it's not quite the same.
Yeah, it's probably a bit different.
I think you can hear me now. Yeah, I mean, so just because I didn't really phrase it as a question, but I mean, I feel that that's what's kind of missing. One thing that's similar about Tokyo and Toronto to me is the fact that we really are organized in small neighborhoods, right? We have Little Italy, we have Corktown, and people really for a large part, can live within that neighborhood entirely and walk to everything within that neighborhood and find everything they need within that neighborhood. And I
Yeah.
find the same kind of similarity in Tokyo as well. But what I find less good here is this concept of very large streets everywhere, right? Whereas in Tokyo, they really segregated those neighborhoods. They're encircled by very heavy traffic roads, but within each, there's those tiny, tiny little residential roads where, one car at a time can go through, and it gets very quiet. And I kind of wonder whether that's something we could ever do here. I feel not, but it's worth asking.
Yeah, and it's a perfect description of it. I think there's a fellow named Popper who called it like the egg and dart or something like that typology. It's like each village is like a hard shell with a soft center in the middle. Um, it works. Yeah, all of those really tall 12, 15-story buildings create a very quiet zone. So you can walk 5 minutes from Shibuya Crossing and it's dead quiet and it's very relaxing. That definitely does work. I can kind of almost see some of it happening. I live close to the corner of Bathurst and Bloor, where you have these tall towers that are going up right now. And if you just did that on every road all the way around it, then I guess it would be quite quiet on the interior. But yeah, it's definitely hard to just copy.
Becomes this interesting dilemma though, eh? Like, and this is the thing with our campus master plan too. Who do you want the neighborhoods to be for? There's a balance between making them livable and vibrant for the folks who live there, but we know the neighborhood infrastructure isn't equitably distributed,
Yeah.
right? And so you want to be mindful, I think, of creating design related gates that show people they don't belong, right? And so
Yeah,
our
yeah,
campus is markedly not distinct from the city, in
yeah,
part because we want to be of the city. No ivy, no limestone gates, right? We want to be porous and welcoming,
yeah. No,
right?
it's a good point. And Tokyo doesn't feel like that. It definitely doesn't feel like a gated city here and there, except for like the ones that actually are. The one thing that I think that I didn't touch on that I find so amazing in Tokyo is that, and which I don't like so much about Toronto, because it doesn't have it, is that the social sort of segregation in Tokyo, it's not a thing compared to Toronto at least. You can live next to a flop house and your house could be like $5 million, and right beside you is somebody just decided to build a bunch of $500 a month rental units for people low income or maybe even students or people on pensions and things like that. And that happens all the time. And it's this sort of radical distribution of social groups. It's very common. And I think that also comes out of the planning somehow.
I wonder how much of that is related to this notion of the city is in a state of constant change, right? The idea that you are expecting that what is beside you, if you stay a long time, won't be the same as when you came. Like, I think it's
Yeah.
a really like Toronto is very interesting that way. I think that people, like, I live in the West End, and people who have single family homes, who are ordinary folks, not like high net worth individuals, like they're obviously wealthy enough to own a house, but live 5 minutes from a subway in any other global city.
Yeah.
Like, you have to be ridiculously wealthy to live in a single family home within a walk to a subway. But in Toronto,
Yeah.
we've evolved differently. But people think that we don't need to continue to build density, whereas you could argue that they had that access borrowed from the future. Like, we need to provide more people with
Yeah.
as much access to
Yeah.
both affordable housing and good mobility, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And I don't know how to solve that. It seems really hard because Toronto seems destined or heck bent on this sort of towers on a podium thing everywhere, as if that's the only answer. And there's just a huge amount of Toronto's not even discussed. And that's a
yeah.
big problem.
Catherine, I don't know if your hand's up new or I just noticed it up now, but you
Yeah,
can just talk. Yeah.
it's oh, sorry. Yeah, so it is new. I was basically just kind of thinking the other thing I really enjoy about Tokyo that I think is a problem in Toronto that I think is that one is easy addressable is lighting, street lighting. in those small neighborhood, there's very, very little lighting. And what that means that the night sky is very visible even from downtown Tokyo. You see so many stars. And here, basically, if you see the moon, it's a good night. And I recognize that the problem is most likely vandalism and crime. That basically that's not a thing that people have to worry about in Japan. Whereas here, I think if you don't have a lamppost, then you can have crime in that location or something, or that's the usual thinking anyways. So I wonder what you thought about that, or how that can be approached in a context of urban planning, to get us to a place where we can see the sky in the middle of a city.
Yeah, I don't know that I've actually seen this guy in Tokyo, but you could be right. I might not have looked, to be
You
honest.
forgot to look. I assure you, you can.
Really,
Even
yeah,
right next to Shibuya.
yeah. That's a huge thing. I mean, I'm worried about my daughters, going around Toronto, but on their own. But I never cared about. I never had to think about it twice that they would travel to Shibuya on their own, even when they're 5 or 6 years old, getting on a train or something wouldn't really bother me so much. And that's part of that. Like the society is just much more safe. I don't know how to solve that. It could be because it's so homogeneous that it just works. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, Tokyo went through this weird thing though, right? Like in the 1960s, everyone was afraid of the city. They all came in from the countryside, and you saw all these houses that were made out of concrete and they had no windows. The windows were only on, looking to the sky, like kind of like Roman courtyard houses. But now they're all glass because no one's afraid anymore because they've lived there so long. Maybe there's something about trying to be more open and having more people just being on the street that will help. I don't know if that's a real comment or not, but maybe a hope.
I suspect that, like people, part of it is just we're used to well-lit cities, right? Like there are lots of European cities also that are well lit at night. So it may not be, part of it just may be that people, it may not be just about safety, but also just that some people think it's pretty. There are lots of night installations that are as much about art as anything else. And I think people's perceptions of safety are informed by all kinds of things. I worry more about my kids getting hit by a car than anything else. Like when my kids leave the house, it's a traffic accident that I worry about the
Yeah,
most.
right. Yeah, indeed.
Right. And so I think it's very difficult to make generalized claims about safety because they're so context based, but people are worried about different kinds of things, I think.
Yeah. I think it's a hard one to copy.
Yeah.
Depends.
But Catherine, to your point about the night sky, it would be, there are all kinds of other reasons to darken the city at particular points in time. And I don't know, like you can think about like having one night a month where you deliberately tried to darken the city so that everybody could see, on a full moon or something. It would be an interesting little civic exercise, which is like, you could have one like night sky night or something like that. It'd
Yeah,
be
as
fun.
a physicist, it's a heartbreak to live here, and it's so much
Yes.
nicer when in Tokyo when I can see the star. And I mean, I kind of forget because I'm a city person, I'm not a countryside person, but that's the only thing I do miss about living in the countryside is being able to see the stars. But you can in Tokyo and you cannot here, and it does break my heart because it damages the ability for people to become young amateur astronomers, for example, right? The ability to, and we always talking about connecting with nature and having roof gardens and all that, but we never talk about the sky. And I think it's a pretty big deal too. And it really sucks that the city lighting has basically destroyed that for anyone, whether they want it or not. And
Feels
so
like
I
something
really,
we should
sorry.
do in the dead of winter, right? Like on the coldest night, like how you change your smoke detector batteries when the time changes. It feels
Yeah,
like in January
yeah.
17th should be night sky night where we all like embrace the dark and go out all dressed up. And anyway, I think it could be a really cool, I think like as a science in the city activity, Catherine, there's huge
Yeah.
potential in that, like a celebration of the sky, but in the middle of the winter when it's really cold. It could be a really cool thing.
Well,
Anyway,
that's the thing. With those long nights, we should take more advantage of what it has to offer. It's a good point.
yeah, I think it like as a civic festival idea, it has real, I think it's cool. I think it'd be really neat.
I love the once a month. You can totally steal it. If you've got any swing with the city, like please make this happen. I'd be very
I
grateful.
think
I
it'll
mean,
be
U
a
of T would for sure. They have an observatory on campus. They would for sure be taking advantage of that. And their astronomy nights are hugely popular, right? And I think if more people could do amateur stuff in their backyard, it'd be tremendously valuable if we want to talk about interesting people in science generally too, right?
I think it's a be fun to think about as like as a student project on campus to combine science students with, you know, the folks in the creative school. They have a creative industries program there and planning students. Like it's a cool student project idea to think about, which is advocating for a night sky night. So in the winter. Okay, it's
I'll have to reach out if
11:50.
that's gonna happen.
Yeah, I will for sure. See, this is what happens when you get together. I think we should end on this note. So we've still got a bunch of guests. Thanks so much to everybody to coming. We look forward to posting this. And Will, thank you for your time today. And thanks to Luke and Claire behind the scenes for helping making this happen.
Thank you.
Nice to see everybody. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.